house. Now I'm excited to introduce to you today's ataxia expert, Dr. Chip Wilmot. Dr. Wilmot is a neurologist and researcher at Emory University, and Dr. Wilmot is most currently active in clinical research in ataxia. Welcome, Dr. Wilmot.
See you. Okay, it'll be an hour. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Sorry, just it's a shared office that I'm in. I'm over at the VA today, and excited to be here and to answer your questions. Hope to do a good job answering everybody's. It's a little hard when there's a lot of different people coming from a lot of different perspectives, but we will absolutely do our best. I've also got my computer with some questions that have been sent in early. So I'll be looking over here and other monitors. So if I look like I'm not looking at you, it's not because I'm not looking at you. I'm just looking at something else. That's all. Okay. So some questions were sent in early, and I want to be able to certainly address them. Somebody took the effort to go ahead and do that. I want to make sure that we can do that. And I think the best way for me to do it is just to go kind of through them one by one. And you should hopefully hear that your question was answered. If you were the one who submitted the question and you have a follow-up question, you can type it in the chat and hopefully we'll get to it. Can't be absolutely certain we will. Okay, so the first question was about, it was actually a very interesting question. This is very specific, but it's somebody with reflux disease, gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD, and they've been on omeprazole forever, which a lot of people are on, and for good reasons medically. If you don't take something to inhibit acid reflux and you get chronic acid reflux, it can make changes in your esophagus that can become precancerous and actually become cancerous of the esophagus. So there's really important reasons to treat reflux. It's not just a little bit of symptoms that you can get from heartburn or something. And they were wondering, could this be related to why I have ataxia at all? Could there be a bacterial overgrowth situation, which might be what happens when you change the acid level? There's going to be changes in what we call your microflora, which is your gut bacteria and that type of thing. And the answer is, we don't know of any defined connection that way. There have been some questions along this line that's come up with a number of diseases, not specifically just ataxia. I would say there's not, the way I would answer that is there's no clear connection. And it is important to treat reflux. So I wouldn't get off the reflux treatment just because you think it might contribute to ataxia, because that connection is too thinly established. What I will add is that the state of your microflora in your GI system and how that interacts with you as a organism and your brain and neurologic disease and other diseases like diabetes, weight balance, a bunch of other things, is a really fascinating topic right now. There's a lot of research in that, particularly, in the field of gastroenterology. And I think coming into the future, studies on that will be, 50 years from now, we'll be talking a lot more about gut microbiota, the bacteria that live in your gut and how it influences disease. I just don't think we're there yet, especially for ataxia, to make any really major change. All right, regenerative therapy, work for those ataxia. So, I mean, that can have a few different meanings, and I'm not exactly sure what you meant. I'm going to take it this way. The most important thing you can do if you have ataxia is to do physical rehabilitation types of things, physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech therapy. You can still train your brain to function without normal cerebellar function, and therefore with ataxia, you can train it to function better. The brain can still learn some workarounds, and that's what therapy does. And it might actually have some impact on the disease. We don't really understand that very well, but there's some interesting animal research that suggests, for instance, exercise might be able to improve the health of diseased neurons and keep them working more normally for longer. So that's very important. Regenerative therapy can also have very specific meanings. There's some like stimulation and other things along those lines that can be done. Sometimes they're done for people who have neuropathy. And no real good evidence that it works in ataxia. So there's another question about inheritance of spinocerebellar ataxia. So let me just clarify, ataxia can be genetic, can be non-genetic. If it is genetic, it can be dominant, or it can be recessive, or it could be X-linked, which is a little different, but we're going to ignore that for right now. If it's dominant, that means that you only need one abnormal gene of the pair, because every gene, we have a pair of genes. We have two of them in our body. One we got from mom, one we got from our dad. And if you have just one abnormal gene that causes a disease, that's a dominant disease. And so your children could be at risk, about 50% risk, because they're either going to get the abnormal gene or they're going to get the normal gene of that pair. And so they're at 50% risk. If that 50% is true all the time, but if you're 90 years old and you don't have any symptoms, the chance that you're going to develop symptoms later is pretty low, because the chances are you inherited the normal gene. So it is an absolute 50%, but your particular age changes the lens that we view that. The problem with some diseases and many of the SCAs, like SCA 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 17, there are others, that sometimes it's not just a single mutation, but the actual mutation that causes disease causes an expanded element in the gene. One of the sequences that's normally repetitive elongates out, and that causes disease. And that elongation can change during transmission. So from mother to daughter, from father to daughter, father to son, mother to son, the expansion can change. And that's why sometimes in some of these diseases, as you get further along in the family history, pedigree, going from grandparent to parent to child, maybe to grandchild, some of the diseases, most notably, for instance, in SCA7, it happens a lot. And it can happen a good bit in SCA3 and sometimes in SCA2. And it can happen in a lot of them that have expansions as their basis. Sometimes it doesn't happen very much. You can get disease earlier and earlier in life, and as you go down the pedigree. So maybe the kid gets, the grandchild gets disease at age 17, whereas the grandparent got it at age 55. That can happen. Sometimes it's a mild amount of anticipation where there isn't much change. Sometimes there's no anticipation because it's a little bit of a roll of the dice. The abnormal expansions that cause disease don't always get bigger and therefore more of a problem. Sometimes they contract a little bit. It depends on the type of SCA. For instance, SCA5 is not an expansion. It's a point mutation, generally speaking, or there are other things that it can be actually. That's a bad example, but but it's a fixed, every mutation that is in that family is going to stay the same mutation. It's not going to change through transmission from parent to child. But SCA1, 2, 3, 7, for instance, are going to do that. Okay. Neuropathy related to SCA3, yes, probably. There are other causes of neuropathy, and just because you have SCA3 doesn't mean you can't have neuropathy from other reasons. For instance, diabetes is the most common. Excessive alcohol use can cause neuropathy. There's some inherited neuropathies, but it'd be unusual to have two different things. So most people who have neuropathy and SCA3, we might do a really brief screen to just say, is there diabetes there or something? But generally speaking, we are going to attribute it to the SCA3 because it is definitely known to occur in SCA3. Let's see, some of the main problem is hearing weakness of thigh muscles. Yes, and difficulty climbing stairs and stuff. So in SCA3, which is the most common dominantly inherited ataxia, by the way, the dominant inherited ataxias are, by correct terminology, those are the spinocerebellar ataxias, SCA. The recessive ataxias sometimes just have their own name, like Friedreich's ataxia, let's say, or sometimes now there's a nomenclature where we call it SCAR, R for recessive, or SCAR. And then sometimes there's other systems of naming the recessive ataxias, but SCA really should refer to a dominantly inherited ataxia, not a sporadic ataxia that just happens to happen without a genetic cause. Although some doctors will still call that an SCA, that's kind of incorrect. So SCA3, which is the most common inherited dominant ataxia, is something that can also, in addition to neuropathy, can cause weakness. Sometimes that weakness is because of neuropathy. Sometimes that and neuropathy just means the nerves in the arms and legs are damaged. It's not referring to a nerve problem in your head. We don't call that neuropathy. It can also be responsible for motor neuron disease. What is motor neuron disease? Well, your motor system that makes you move starts off in your brain, goes down, crosses over to the other side, goes down your spinal cord, and then we call that the upper motor neuron. And when that fires, it sends a signal down to move. And then there's the lower motor neuron, which comes out of your spinal cord and becomes that peripheral nerve that goes into your muscles. So you have at least two nerves there that drive your muscles. And sometimes those motor nerves, either the upper one or the lower one that starts in your spinal cord, can degenerate. The most commonly known motor neuron disease is not an ataxia, it's ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. And that's a very aggressive, significant kind of disease that makes you very weak and really takes away your movement. So that's a non-ataxia example of motor neuron disease. Well, because ataxias can sometimes affect things other than the cerebellum, which is what causes the incoordination that we refer to as ataxia, those genes are also present in other neurons, and sometimes we have other problems outside the cerebellum. One of those problems might be neuropathy, problems with the peripheral nerve. Sometimes the problem is in a motor neuron, and then you can get weak. So I've had SCA3 patients, who couldn't get out of a chair, could barely move their legs because of the weakness. Doesn't always happen. There's other reasons to be weak and difficulty getting out of a chair or going up and down stairs. And those might be, for instance, stiffness. Dystonia is a common thing that we see in SCA3 patients, particularly those with earlier onset. And that can really impact movement. Sometimes it's the tightness of the muscles that affect the movement more than true weakness or ataxia. But it's still can be very impaired because of that, and still can be difficult to treat. Let's see. We don't probably have impossible. So there's a question about stem cells. This comes up quite frequently. There are various kinds of stem cells. The concept of a stem cell is exciting and neat. The actual practical implication or implementation, I should say, I'm sorry, of stem cell therapy to treat ataxias is simply not ready for prime time, and we don't really encourage people doing that. As part of a study where the costs are absorbed by the company or the grant or whatever, if you don't have any liability, you're not being charged any money, anything like that, and the data is being collected in a rigorous manner that has been peer reviewed and approved by knowledgeable colleagues who agree with the scientific intent of the research study, that would be reasonable potentially to participate in, but not as a treatment, because it's not a treatment. As a research study, it would be reasonable if you want to be involved in research. The problem with stem cells are the following. There's two general approaches. One is, let's try to replace the damaged neurons, for instance. And that's really difficult because you've got to take neuronal progenitor cells and somehow get them into the right place, let's say in the brain or the spinal cord or something, and have them not only differentiate and become functional neurons, but also establish the appropriate connections with their neighbors. And sometimes it's not even neighbors, but connections from way far away, because that's the way the brain is connected up. Sometimes the connections are over, feet. And the brain just has a difficult time making those reconnections. So we're still studying that. Someday, hopefully that will be a treatment. The other kind of stem cell treatment that can happen is mesenchymal stem cells, or what you can do is kind of just take these general stem cells that they can get from your fat, harvest there, and they make some growth factors and things, and then they re-inject it. And the idea there is that you're not really replacing any damaged cells. What you're doing is providing something that has some growth properties in the hope that it will be able to stimulate the nervous system in a beneficial way so that improvement will occur. The problem with those is those are usually not in research studies. Those are usually being charged to the patient without proven efficacy. They can be expensive. Nobody knows like what the active growth factor that might be doing a benefit. And nobody knows that there is any benefit. I mean, the data, there's no data rigorously obtained using appropriate outcome measures and things to say that somebody treated that way versus somebody who was not treated that way did better. So in general, the mesenchymal stem cells are being offered for everything under the sun, and it's more from companies that are more interested in the for-profit thing at the expense of the patient. And so we're not really big proponents of those types of treatments. Let's see, I don't know if there's another question about passing it on and about that anticipation I was talking about, and about having children. Should we have children? Great question. I can't stress how important it is to really just understand what the risks are. I've actually done a couple of research studies on this as part of my research interests. Ideally, the dominantly inherited, especially ataxias, we could potentially stamp out from existence in a few generations if nobody passed on the gene. That would mean not having children, or adopting or having an egg donor or a sperm donor, or maybe in vitro fertilization with testing. Of course, that decision of having children or not having children is completely a personal decision. Nobody can tell you not to have a child, even if there's some genetic risk there. That is your decision, to have them or not to have them. But I think it's critical that that decision be informed by correct knowledge and not kind of just head in the sand. Oh, we're just going to do it this way because I haven't bothered to really look into things at all. So there are not only, there's a lot of information out there, and the best way to get that information about what the risks potentially might be if you do have a child, for that child, are in ways of mitigating against that risk, ways of changing that risk to your benefit and the benefit of your child so they won't be having this disease, is by talking to genetic counselors. Genetic counselors, that is their career. That is what they do. I know a lot about genetics. I know a lot about this disease. I talk to my patients about this, but especially when it gets down to issues about should I have a child or not, all that type of thing, I will always send to a patient to a genetic counselor. I think it's important to use the specialist appropriately, and that is definitely an appropriate use of a genetic counselor. So I recommend talking to them. Somebody asked about Blade Therapeutics calpain inhibitor for SCA3, a very specific question. And I knew a little bit about it, but not too much. I did a little bit of research because I got this ahead of time. There are lots of, it's kind of in preclinical testing now. So here's what happens in research. When you know the cause of ataxia, and the genetic ones are where we know the cause the most. So you know that there's an abnormality in the SCA3 gene. Well, the way research is done is, why does this SCA3 mutation cause nerve problems? Why does it damage neurons and cause symptoms and cause disease? So you study, in tissue culture, in animals, in test tubes, you look into what this SCA3 gene and protein product that genes eventually make proteins, and they have actions in the cells. And you say, what are the pathophysiologic mechanisms, which means why does this mutation cause problems? Because you feel like if we can solve that and fix it, we'll be able to treat the disease. And that's done for everything. That's the basic model of biomedical research, neurology, and in other fields. So what is the pathophysiology of SCA3? Why does an SCA3 mutation, or for any of the other ones, cause disease? And the answer is, it's complex. It's really complex because our cells are super complex, right? We have 20,000 plus genes, all of which are making protein products. We have thousands and thousands of small molecules that are not made by genes directly. They're made by modification of the stuff you eat and your metabolism, and synthesized by the liver, but float around in your body or whatever, that are, there's just hundreds of thousands of chemicals that are floating around in each cell in a network of interaction where changes in one might have downstream effects on the other. And making sense of that is what biology and biomedical science is all about. That's why, the National Ataxia Foundation is funding research. It's to try to understand these things. Well, one of the mechanisms whereby maybe the SCA3 problem exists is through protein aggregation. This is a big theme in a lot of neurodegenerative diseases, ataxia and other ones, where abnormal proteins, because they have a mutation in them, start to get sticky and stick to other things, including other abnormal SCA3 proteins, but also maybe other ones. And so there's this aggregation issue. That's one theme. Changes in the way that abnormally folded proteins, because of the expansion in SCA3, maybe it's just a abnormal folding of the protein. That's causing problems separate from an aggregation. That's another possibility. Maybe it's change in the normal function of that protein. That protein was there to do something, and if it's got a mutation in it, maybe it's not doing what it's supposed to do. So the bottom line is we try to figure that out and then see if there's ways of improving it. And with the aggregation issue and kind of some of the other stuff, and there's a lot of other things like ubiquitination, which you don't need to worry about, but the other pathways that the SCA3 protein is involved in can be altered. And so what you try to do is figure out to benefit. And calpain is a normal enzyme that you have in cells that degrades other proteins. It's a calcium activated protease. So it chews up proteins. And there's different subtypes of calpain, and there's lots of different proteases that our bodies have. Some of which might be more focused on abnormal proteins being chewed up, but sometimes you want to chew up regular proteins in order to modify them in a functional way. Calpain inhibitors are being studied in a number of diseases because it looks like this calpain might be an issue. And sometimes it's, the pathways for each particular disease where the calpain inhibitors have been looked at are different, but it's been studied for neuropathies. It's got some interesting data for regeneration, for other neurodegenerative diseases. In SCA3, there's been animal studies that suggest some benefit, and that's exciting. So it's in the preclinical phase. Drug companies, get some proprietary inhibitor that they can put a patent around and study and hope eventually that it will work. They can take it to market, do a clinical study in human beings or a series of them, and then prove benefit and be able to help people. And then, usually if it's coming from a private company, there's a financial reason that they're developing this. They hope to make money with it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing in our system. That's what drives drug development a lot. For that one specifically, it's pretty early on. It looks good, but there have been lots of things that look good like this that are not going to be applicable ultimately for human studies or for human use. All I would say is, so there's many things that have been looked at in animal models that show some benefit, but you take that huge list of potential compounds based on that particular disease mechanism you found, and your particular molecule to benefit that disease problem. And then, what actually ends up in clinical trials is going to be narrowed down through a series of studies. And I have no idea whether this compound will ever end up being clinically useful at all. Okay. Coming down to some more of these. Just a question about ataxia in PSP. And PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy, is more of a Parkinson's-like disease, but there can be cerebellar problems in it. Certainly there's balance problems. And, there aren't any medicines that help that balance problem very well. Sometimes we try Parkinson's medicines for the Parkinsonian component of the disease, which is the slow movements. Doesn't usually help all that much, honestly. And then the exercises are just the standard stuff for balance, going to PT. I don't have specific recommendations. I never really make specific PT recommendations in terms of exercises. I rely on my physical therapist to do that because they have a lot of experience and that's what they do. Other questions about just what can be done with walking. Again, it's mainly therapeutic. We'll get to a couple of the other questions about medicines that might help ataxia symptom in just a second. A lot of questions that came up on gene testing, saying, you know, my mother was affected, I got tested or she got tested and it was negative, so they don't know what to do. And I'm not going to address them really specifically, but just say that's a very common theme. It makes a big difference what tests there were. So that you can test for a single gene, like let's say, I think this is SCA3. I might send off a specific test for SCA3. Might come back positive, might come back negative. I can also send a small panel of genes, like I'll look for all the repeat expansion diseases, like SCA1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8, you know, et cetera. 10, 17, 28, 36, it keeps going. And those will sometimes come back positive. If they're negative, it doesn't mean you don't have ataxia, and it doesn't mean that you don't have a genetic ataxia. Let's say that you have a very strong family history of ataxia. Your mother was affected, you're affected, you have a sister who is affected, you have another unaffected sister, you have an aunt who's affected, or a uncle who's affected, your grandfather was affected, whatever. That's going to be a genetic ataxia. I mean, let's face it, you know, it's there's not going to be another explanation. It's going to be a genetic ataxia. And because it's going to be a genetic ataxia, we ought to be able to find the gene, right? Because we have these amazing abilities. And the answer is no, unfortunately not. We probably can find it if we know it's genetic, if we test hard enough. If we do enough detailed testing of our 3 billion base pairs, we ought to be able to find it. But you know what? The best data, the most recent data, suggests that for the most commonly used clinically orderable tests, some caveats to this, but even in genetically known cases that have a strong family history, up to about 30% of people, we're not going to be able to find that mutation with our current knowledge. Why is that? Because we don't always know what is a mutation or not, because we all differ from each other. So it's hard distinguishing between just a variant, some abnormal piece of DNA. You know, one base pair out of your 3 billion is a little different than we usually find in humans. How do we know if that's really causing it or not? So over time, we establish this better and better. And not only that, but our ability to find every abnormality genetically is a little bit difficult. So the bottom line is, if you were tested negative, but you have a strong family history, re-explore whether additional testing is warranted. If you just had a panel that looked at, you know, 170 ataxia genes and it was negative, you might need to do whole exome testing, which looks at the coding portions of all 20,000 genes. If your exome testing was negative, or if your panel was negative, or if your single gene was negative, maybe, you know, these days we can do whole genome testing, which has, you know, a little bit of issues with it too, just in terms of the amount of information we get and everything else. But genome testing, where we're looking at everything, might reveal something else. But again, even with genome testing, we have negative tests sometimes when it still is genetic. Then there's the other issue of those people who don't have a strong family history, don't have any family history, don't have any real reason to believe that it's genetic. And there can be non-genetic causes of ataxia. So you can search till the cows come home and you're never going to find something because it's not genetic. All right. Let me just read a couple more of these. So asking about gene therapy for SCA, and, you know, that's being worked on pretty hard right now. And ultimately, I think that might be a good answer. It's still, you know, ways away. So don't put too many eggs in that basket right now from a treatment for you standpoint. Put a lot of hope in it for the future. And we need to be putting a lot of research efforts in it to work out the details, because the details are key. Okay, that's another genetic question that I had. Somebody else raised a question of, do I really have ataxia? And this is a problem because all gait imbalance is not ataxia. And so I get plenty of referrals by other neurologists who have called things ataxia, but really what they meant was gait imbalance, which is fine because I see gait imbalance due to other conditions that are not ataxia, and that's important to evaluate as well. But once there are certain things in eye movements, moving the head and looking at the eyes, and in the way that movements of the hands are, sometimes in the speech, that really can nail it down as a cerebellar problem. And if it's a cerebellar movement problem, it's going to be ataxia by and large. And then it's more in our backyard in terms of what disease it would be rather than another specialist's backyard. Some people get referred to me and they're only for imbalance, and they really just have a bad hip problem, or maybe spinal stenosis and radiculopathy or something like that. So that happens. And those are potentially fixable. So, okay, I think I got to the end of my questions here. Yep, I did. So I don't see anything else in these that I wanted to specifically address. So we can take questions from the chat. I have not been able to be monitoring the chat just because I've had to share my attention with my other screens.
Well, I'll be happy to give you some questions that have been submitted in the chat. We've had several.
Yeah, questions. Why don't you go ahead and do that, and I will.
Absolutely.
I'll also try to be looking at it now, but go ahead and do that.
Sure. Well, going off of eyesight, we did have a question on that topic. The question is for FA, decreasing eyesight. What are the coming treatments being researched that hold the soonest help potential, and then which in the reasonable future will have the most efficacy?
Really good question. So in Friedreich's, there's a few different things that can happen with vision. One is just a background decreased vision due to the stability of the eyes. In advanced Friedreich's typically, and not in everybody, but in a subset, there can be a profound vision loss due to what's called an optic neuropathy. And optic neuropathies in Friedreich's can lead to virtual or at least functional blindness. Right now, there is no real good treatment. So Debenone, I think in Canada it's approved right now, but there was some evidence that, because Friedreich's is a mitochondrial disease, and mitochondrial dysfunction frequently is a cause of other kinds of optic neuropathies. So the hope is that we can do something for mitochondrial function that will improve the eyesight. I think the effect of Debenone, if any, is low. There have been some of the other research studies where there was some suggestion by other antioxidants, the EPI 743 trial, maybe there was like just, anecdotal kind of indications that maybe something was being helpful there. So I think the focus is on improving mitochondrial function. The problem is it's a hard thing to treat even in other conditions where we know exactly what's causing it. It's very important that other causes be ruled out and that it not just be assumed to happen in Friedreich's. It can be pretty rapid and aggressive. And in general, when rapid and aggressive things happen, they can have worse outcomes and can be a little more difficult to treat. Kind of true. So a lot of times, once it starts within a few months, there can be a pretty significant change. I don't know of specific trials going on right now. There might be something that I'm not aware of. I'm certainly not doing any of them, but I would look towards the mitochondrial things. Most of the over-counter stuff, CoQ10, other antioxidants, selenium, resveratrol, other stuff, might have some benefit, but it's certainly not proven. And so I think right now the Debenode is the closest thing. Still not really the answer that we want, but hopefully there will be a better answer in the future. The other thing is that so this is pie in the sky maybe, but one of the good things about the problems with Friedreich's is that if we could get a little more expression of frataxin, the protein product of the affected gene, in cells, we might be able to benefit patients. So there's some protein replacement trials going on in Friedreich's ataxia. And those have not been specifically targeted to the optic neuropathy or the eye. But one of the cool things about the eye is that the neurons that are responsible for your vision are right there, and they're very accessible. So it might mean injection into the eye, which doesn't sound exactly palatable, but we do them all the time for stuff like certain kinds of macular degeneration and things. So the eye might be able to be locally treated, potentially with a frataxin replacement strategy, or even with gene therapy kind of approaches to replace the frataxin. And with Friedreich's, if we can just boost up the level in cells of frataxin, of an appropriate form of frataxin, to we don't need to get it high. We don't need to get it even back to normal range. We just need to get it back to like carrier range, which would be 50% or so. It might be able to improve symptoms. So that's what I would say.
Very good. Thank you for your thoughts on that topic, Dr. Wilmot. We have some genetic questions. One of them is, I was diagnosed with SCA unknown by Athena about 7 years ago. Should I get retested? Where, what kind, and do I go through my local neurologist?
So I don't really understand the statement of being diagnosed with ataxia by Athena. Athena is a testing company, and if it was unknown, then the Athena test would be negative, I would assume. Athena just tests a small number of genes. There's better, wider range of tests right now. So ataxia is really a clinical diagnosis. I mean, if you get, let's say you have no symptoms at all, but you happen to be in a research study or something, and you are positive for an SCA3 gene mutation, an expansion. Maybe your parent was affected, but you don't have any symptoms. Do you have SCA3? Good question. I would consider, we call that pre-manifest or something. It would suggest that at some point you're going to develop symptoms, but you don't have any clinical symptoms at the time. You don't really have ataxia. You're just carrying an abnormal gene. So the ataxia diagnosis is a clinical diagnosis. And yes, you might consider additional testing. I don't know that I would do that testing through Athena. If they've already done it, I think you probably need more widespread testing, like a whole exome testing, or maybe even genome testing. There are a number of companies that are doing these types of things now, some of which can be expensive. Athena can be expensive at times. There's some that have business models where they're not charging as much. And the best way to access a lot of genetic testing is through a genetics department. Those are usually, some of the ataxia specialists are very into the genetics and, would never refer to genetics. Some would refer to genetics. I refer some of my patients to genetics. I do some of the testing myself. It's a mixed bag for me. Some of the other people, are so much into the genetics, there's no reason to refer. And then some people, especially like a local neurologist who's not an ataxia specialist, probably does not understand the details of ataxia genetic testing. And so I think you need to get into more specialized hands to decide what further testing is needed. That can either be through an ataxia specialist or through a genetics department.
Thank you. Our other question is, does it make a difference if you get a female or male SCA gene?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Does it make a difference if you get a female or male SCA gene?
No, so the female male thing, subtle differences, maybe, not major differences. Most of the genes for SCA are they're autosomal dominant, so they're not an X-linked gene. All that really means, X-linked disease is more likely to happen in males, generally speaking, because one of the X's is inactivated and the Y is non-functional and a bunch of other genetic reasons. What X-linked means is you can't have a male-to-male transmission. So you can never, as a male, inherit your father's X-linked disease, for instance. Now, the way that it might be affected, or that we might have an explanation, is through some hormonal differences and other things like that, and also through the transmission. So remember, I talked about the change in some of these gene mutations when the expansion goes through the mother-son or father-son or mother-daughter or father-daughter transmission. That's through their gametes, right? The sperm or the egg. And that's when it can change. Might change at other times too, but that change is sometimes a little different, not so much on the sex of the receiving. In other words, if it's a mother or a son, a daughter or a son, but whether you got for some of the conditions, whether you got your disease from your mother might differ a little bit than from your father. And with some of these, the transmission through your father might lead to a little more expansion than through the mother. That's a general theme, but doesn't apply to everybody.
All right. Okay. So our next question is, does ataxia lead to an expected shorter life expectancy? Similarly, do you know if MSA leads to a shorter life expectancy?
Right. So life expectancy in neurodegenerative diseases, things that lead to progressive problems, is always complicated because frequently there's nothing that directly kills you and ends your life when you have these diseases. But so in that sense, it doesn't decrease life expectancy. But if you look at people across the board, in other words, you take a population who has the disease and you take a control population who doesn't have the disease and you compared them, you would find more early deaths and in the patients who have SCA, and therefore it does decrease life expectancy. Why is that? Well, it's normally because some of the functions that we normally do to ward off infections are impaired in ataxia. Swallowing. When swallowing becomes a problem, the swallow function is really a problem. There's more likelihood that either things you eat or drink are going to go down the wrong way, or sometimes even just your saliva, which we're constantly swallowing, even when we don't know it. So some of the bacteria that's normally supposed to only be up here can get down into the lungs where they're not supposed to be and cause a pneumonia. That's a problem. So aspiration pneumonias can happen. Some patients, become so immobile, either due to that motor neuron disease or dystonia or other things like that, that feeding just, maybe their swallowing isn't as bad, but just the act of feeding and chewing and stuff is difficult. So they might have to have a tube feed at later stages of the disease. Very few of my patients do that or ever get, in that situation, but it does occasionally happen. And then you can have, tube infections or other things like that. You can get increased risk of urinary tract infections, of bed sores and things like that if you're immobile. These are all in pretty advanced disease, but after having these diseases for many years, a lot of patients will be advanced. And so the setups for infection and other problems will limit lifespan in many of the SCAs. If you have milder diseases where these types of things, swallowing problems, immobility, are not normally a feature, then lifespan usually would not be impaired. Let me just say, sometimes there are specific issues with life limiting problems. So the swallowing issues is like an indirect, right? It can definitely crop up, and it does in a lot of people, but there's no, time that it definitely will. For MSA, and then let's look also like at Friedreich's ataxia, you can get a cardiomyopathy, and there can be heart problems, and the kind of cardiopulmonary issues might be thought of as a more direct impact of the disease that is lifespan limiting. And so it's always tied to more severe disease. In MSA, because the autonomic nervous system can be affected, meaning your blood pressure control, you're more likely to go into cardiac arrhythmias and things. So MSA is more life limiting in general, lifespan decrease, than in SCA.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wilmot. Our next question is, I was diagnosed with subacute cerebellar ataxia post-COVID, probably metabolic in origin. What are the metabolic causes of ataxia?
Let me just say the very first part of that about you were diagnosed with.
Sure, I was diagnosed with subacute cerebellar ataxia post-COVID.
Yeah, I got that part, but what was the background on the person?
That was the first part. I was diagnosed with subacute cerebellar ataxia
post-COVID.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So and so COVID can cause neurologic problems, that it can do that in a number of ways. A lot of the severe COVID reactions are kind of more immune response related. And we have many diseases that are immunologic in origin that cause ataxia, and typically kind of a subacute ataxia. The post-COVID or the definitively COVID-related ataxias have not been well studied yet. Ataxia as part of a global kind of CNS problem is well recognized from COVID in those patients who get really sick. And in other conditions, I have, many of my patients have an autoimmune ataxia, anti-GAD antibodies causing ataxia, or maybe a paraneoplastic ataxia, where maybe there's a cancer somewhere in the body, you make an antibody against that cancer, but there are these things called meaning cancer, onconeural antigens. So some of the things that the antibodies recognize on cancers in order to attack the cancer, which is a good thing, are also in neurons. And so those antibodies sometimes attack the cerebellum. That type of thing, some is a very specific thing that we can easily test for, because we know what that antigen is that those antibodies can be directed against and that can attack the cerebellum and also attack cancers or maybe viruses or other things. But many times we see patients that fit that profile, but do not have a clearly identified antibody. That's partly because we just don't know all the antibodies that can do this, partly because maybe it's more complicated than that. Maybe the antibody is only a small portion of it. Maybe it's some specific immune cell attack that is not antibody mediated. And those are really hard to identify. So there's plenty of reasons to have a subacute ataxia due to kind of an autoimmune type of thing. And I would think that what you're talking about with COVID is that. There's also para-infectious ataxia, so particularly common in young kids who develop an ataxia after a viral infection. It's a post-viral situation that, again, we think is kind of autoimmune, but the details on that are not super well worked out, and usually gets better in kids, though with not complete resolution all the time, sometimes with it. And that type of thing rarely, but occasionally can happen in adults as well. This is not for COVID, but just for some unknown virus, little cold thing or something like that. Occasionally we'll see that.
Well, that is good information. Thank you so much. I know we're getting to the top of the hour, so we'll just take a few more of your questions. Our next question is, my son has TBI and has ataxia. He was in a coma for 3 months. Are there any medications that can help?
So that comes down to the symptomatic question. And I was hoping that we would get to that. So the question is, what can we do for ataxia? If, we're hoping when we have a defined cause that we can dream up, small molecule like a calpain inhibitor or a genetic therapy or something. But in the meantime, we'd like to be able to treat the symptom of ataxia. We can, somebody who has essential tremor, just a movement like this that is tremor and not ataxia, we can give primidone or propranolol to and make them better. That's like the Katharine Hepburn had essential tremor. Parkinson's, we can give medicines that can improve some of the movements in Parkinson's, the slowness, sometimes the tremor to some degree, the stiffness, not so much the balance as well, but we can treat it to some degree. So we like to be able to give medicine to improve ataxia. There really honestly isn't much. Sometimes patients who have trauma have a kind of cerebellar outflow tremor, which there's a various number of names by that, a Holmes tremor named after a guy, or a cerebellar outflow, sometimes a midbrain tremor. And there's some hope that some medicines might help that tremor. It can be pretty darn violent, and it can have both rest and action components, positional components. It can be very proximal, have a proximal and a distal component. The medicines that are tried for that are primidone and carbidopa levodopa, which is used in Parkinson's disease the most. People will try other things. So we have a smorgasbord of medicines that we try for the symptomatic treatment of the motor symptoms of ataxia. Unfortunately, most of them don't do a lot. I don't personally, in most of my patients, try a huge number of them. I don't go through a laundry list of them, but other ataxia specialists who are wonderful doctors do more of that. And I think it's just a style and that type of thing. Sue Perlman typically tries many things, and she's a wonderful doctor. So it's not right or wrong to try something or not to try something. I think in my experience, I've caused more problems with side effects and benefited the ataxia less. And I've just usually don't try it. It depends on the patient. If patient really wants to try something, then we can go through some things. But in general, nothing works very well. For a post-trauma patient, we'd consider primidone, carbidopa, levodopa, number 1, number 2, maybe number 2, number 1. And then there are other things that occasionally have been tried. I've heard of zonisamide, another anti-epileptic. Sometimes benzodiazepines are used. We have to watch with those, like diazepam and stuff. Klonopin, don't like those in most cases. Other, gabapentin and other things are tried. Some muscle relaxants. Some people are looking at things that have activity in the cerebellum, like baclofen, the combination of baclofen and chlorzoxazone, which Dr. Shakatai has talked about and is studying. And then the other thing I want to mention is the riluzole angle and the trogriluzole. There was another question in here about update on that. So trogriluzole is a modified form of riluzole, which is an ALS medicine, which has activity in the glutamate systems in the brain, but also some study on the cellular properties and ion channels in the cerebellar nuclei where all the output of the cerebellum funnels through. And so the update, so riluzole is available now, but it has some problems, liver toxicity and other things. Trogriluzole is under study, is not available. It's just part of the Biohaven studies. And trogriluzole, the results of the first study that was done were primary endpoints were not met. A second study, the 206 study, was done with slightly redesigned factors. That data is still in process. They're not enrolling patients anymore, but the data is still being collected in the extension phase while other people finish up. And I believe this spring, everybody will be done with the placebo-controlled phase, and there'll be some release of results at that point, as I understand it. And then so the bottom line on treatment of ataxia symptoms are maybe there's something to this riluzole, trogriluzole effect. We don't know. We're waiting for the trogriluzole results. There was a little bit of data on the riluzole, but because of the liver toxicity and other things, those are sometimes used, but not always. And then there are sporadic other things that can be used occasionally. And with those specific recommendations for post-traumatic kinds of things. There's also a question in there about stimulation. That's a big thing in being researched right now and is kind of interesting, but don't have time to get into all that.
Very good. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wilmot, for sharing so much information with us and for answering so many of our questions today. I know that we didn't get to a lot of the questions, so we hope that everyone here will join us for the next Ask the Expert session and submit your questions at that time. And so we can try again to address any questions that we didn't have time to answer today. But thank you all out there for joining us. A recording of this session will be available in the coming days on NAS website and YouTube channel. And I'd like to thank Dr. Wilmot again for being this month's Ask the Expert.
Thanks. Good seeing y'all.
Take care, everyone out there.
Bye-bye.
Bye.